all. Welcome back to our third session of the day. We've had a really smooth, great morning, and I hope everyone else has really enjoyed the discussions that have been taking place in the forums and throughout the presentations. They've been really insightful so far, and I am really keen to keep that ball rolling with our next presentation by Corn Mayer and Glenn Maiden from Fortinet, who will be discussing maturing your approach to cloud to face emergent threats. So I'll introduce our next two speakers from Fortinet. So Glenn Maiden is the Director of Threat Intelligence at Fortinet. He's commenced his career with the ADO in the mid-90s and moved to the Australian intelligence community in 99. Glenn led a breadth of cyber activities, including penetration testing, systems engineering, and cyber ops. Glenn's intelligence activities included threat analysis and reporting and support to defence operations. Now, Glenn works at FortiGuard Labs, heading up threat intelligence ops for Australia. FortiGuard Labs build the security intelligence that underpin advanced security technologies like AI, antivirus, and intrusion prevention and email and web security. Corn Mayer is the Director of Security Solutions. He has more than 15 years experience in network security and delivering cyber resilience solutions, and has had focus on hybrid cloud environments and artificial intelligence to ensure organizations are enabled while also safeguarding their data and applications. He acts as the evangelist for Fortinet activities across Australia and the advanced technology that underpins its success. His role provides leadership and strategy for technical, pre-sales and support initiatives, and he works closely with partners and customers to understand their business drivers and risk posture to reduce their risk to an acceptable level. So Corn and Glenn, I will hand it over to you guys to present your presentation.
I want to leave you guys with 3 things to share and 2 things I want to leave you with. The first thing is I want you to go with this component from I did not know that Fortinet could do that. The second one is understanding the latest threat landscape. And the third one is how can we help you in your business to have the unfair advantage? Now, joining me today is someone I have great respect for in the industry, and it's great for me that we can actually get to work together, and that's Glenn Maiden. So Glenn, please introduce yourself quickly as well.
Thank you, Cornelius. So I think Isaac sort of pretty much covered it. So I work for FortiGuard Labs Australia and New Zealand, which is the threat intelligence business that sort of serves as the firepower for the full sort of Fortinet capability. So we build the policies and the processes and the procedures and the signatures and all that really hardcore bleeding edge threat type information that then goes and pushes out to our infrastructure to help keep our customers safe. So to kick this off, Cornelius, I've heard you speak previously about the cybersecurity placebo effect, and it seems the placebo effect, we hear about it in the medical profession, but it seems a bit unusual to be speaking about it in the in terms of cybersecurity. What do you mean by the placebo effect?
So I think it's in 1811 we discovered the magic of the sugar pill, where it was more pleasing than to benefit for the patient that felt unwell or wanted to take something in the belief that it will make them feel better. And if you fast forward that back to World War, where Henry Beecher in the World War II, he ran out of morphine, and he started to use that for some of the people as well. So we can see there that the placebo there was more of a benefit than to please. And I think the same thing is for us when we talk about regulation or industry practices. Is the question comes a lot of times is it a benefit or is it to please? Which one is it? But I think what we can do within cybersecurity, I really believe that there is a benefit where we can look at both the benefits of looking at the regulation from that perspective. So for me, one of the questions I have is when we look at cybersecurity, let's not focus only on the placebo effect to make things feel better, but I really believe we can we can have a real impact on that. And for me is where I really believe that the placebo effect is one next level on top of that is that we need to give birth to trust. And I feel by talking about that is where we sometimes opening the digital Pandora box, what is causing so much unforeseen problems. And Glenn, what's your view on that statement?
Well, that's interesting, Cornelia. So leading in, when you're talking about the placebo effect, you can see that my picture of the old castle there, which is leading into sort of one of the key threats that we're going to be speaking about today, which is the threats against the intelligent edge. But if you look at this old castle, back in the old days, that was the fortress, and we've all used this metaphor before. But everything bad was on the outside, and everything that was really precious and needed to be protected was on the inside. So they started in the old days. They started digging moats so the attackers couldn't get through the couldn't get underneath the walls. That made it more difficult. They had this is a bad castle, but they had concentric circles. So even if you were able to defeat the perimeter, you had another perimeter on the inside, which is a really good metaphor of the defence in depth that we take so seriously in cybersecurity. And one of the other really cool stories about this particular castle is in a lot of these old castles, the stairs going upwards were running clockwise. And you would think, well, why is that? Is it really for a reason or not? But it was actually when the attackers were coming in, and if they did manage to defeat the perimeter, they would walk up, and most of the attackers would be right-handed and hold their sword in the right hand. So by going up clockwise, they're unable to swing their swords at the defenders. But the trouble with the castle and moat metaphor is, if you look at the modern organisation, if we go to the next slide, Cornelius, hopefully it brings that up. All our precious stuff, which we thought was on the inside, actually isn't. So your HR is probably sitting in SAP or something like that. The sales organisation's probably running in Salesforce. Your email and a lot of your user data is probably sort of sitting in somewhere like Office 365. Your IT systems are probably either in a hybrid cloud or in some form of sort of being pushed to the cloud. And our workers and our most sensitive people are possibly not in the castle at all. They might be working from home because of COVID. So when we think about the old perimeter, which is basically sort of that moat area in our picture, that's no longer relevant. So Cornelius, I think you were going to talk about what that actually means in terms of a typical modern IT multi-edge installation.
Yeah, I think on top of that, with what does it mean from the changes that we've seen, is one of the things that we know is that the edges is expanding everywhere. From the beginning, what we've seen is from all of the users, how it's expanding, how it's connecting to your digital devices. At the same time, we've seen now the need on those components where it needs to connect to my campus, my branch, to my home. And all of that, the components, we've seen that it creates new edges, right? So that's where we talk about the identity edge that's been forming, or the endpoint edge that's been forming. Then we've seen, of course, with the expansion from the cloud, is how do I connect to my cloud with my speed and agility at the same time, is where we've seen the need for SD-WAN, but then also secure SD-WAN to secure the communication for both off the network and on the network capabilities. So that's been a massive thing that we started to see within that impact. And then, of course, how can you secure those things? All of those new edges is that we've started to see is making a big difference within the business itself. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about that, of course, the threat landscape is changing. And I think what will be interesting, Glenn, is to talk about the new threats that we see because of new edges that's expanding.
Yeah, no, thank you. And a good explanation of this sort of what we now call the edge environment. So, instead of just one moat now, we've got literally billions and billions of different edges with billions and billions of different types of threats. So we've just released our threat predictions for 2021, and as part of this conference, there'll be the links to that will be shared. So this is just one particular threat that we'll talk about, the intelligent edge, and then Cornelius and myself will talk about the threats to cloud shortly. But if you look now where everything is so interconnected, a lot of organisations have actually sacrificed. In the old days in our castle, we had sort of centralised, we knew everything was central, so we had a lot of visibility into where our sensitive information is. We've actually given way to that now in this edge environment. We've sacrificed, I guess, sort of that centralized visibility and knowing what was good and what was bad for performance and agility. And that's given a significant advantage to the bad guys. And we've seen it over the course of last year, the threat actors shifting significant resources to attacking this new edge environment. Now, it's not only just, as we know, we've all moved away from the core office to our home. So it's not only just that. When you think about our workers no longer working inside the office. They're sitting at home with potentially an old router. They might have Amazon Alexa or a Google Nest, all this other infrastructure that's plugged in. Maybe their kids have got old iPads or old tablet devices. All this becomes part of the edge and part of the threat. And so if you think of one of the threats to this particular environment, it could be what we've seen lately in Australia is a whole bunch of attacks trying to get access to things like legacy routers. And this is something that we see every day in Australia. If you think of the Amazon Alexa example, you imagine if a threat actor was able to access one of these type of systems, they're going to have a wealth of information about you and your family, not only that they could use for a potential really rich social engineering attack, they could also translate that into the physical world, like potentially disabling a security system that's connected to your home, or perhaps even encrypting everything and then running that for ransom. Two of the other threats, and I'll just be very, very brief here, Cornelius, but what I've also seen in sort of some of the industry verticals in Australia in the last year is some ransomware that is specifically adapting to this edge environment. So we saw a particularly nasty one called eCans, which is a type of commodity ransomware. It actually doesn't care about your IT environment so much as your OT environment, and it supports over 60 different OT type of attacks. So it's absolutely out there aiming to damage the real world. Other ones that I saw just in as recently as December in Australia is high instances of some really, really nasty malware called Alena and Timber. Now, in the case of Alena, it's basically sitting around in that edge environment in your point of sale type of environment, looking to sort of scrape credit card information. Timber, on the other hand, still aimed at stealing information, but it's actually sitting there trying to, as a network sniffer, looking for things like banking logons. So absolutely, this intelligent edge is a new threat environment, and we're seeing the criminals become very, very savvy in coming up with new attacks to be able to exploit this environment.
And on that, what's your view and I want to say the comment on this new thing that we see very much on swarm-based attacks? What do you see as the threats going to be associated with that? And actually, what does it mean if we talk about the future of swarm-based attacks?
Well, the interesting part there, Cornelius, is my boss, Derek Mankey, has been speaking about this particular attack vector for years. So normally, most malware will have to get a foothold into your environment, then it's going to have to call home to what we call the command and control servers. So there needs to be a connection from in the inside to the out, where either it'll send information that's stolen, or it'll receive commands from the attacker to do something remotely. If you think of a swarm attack that's basically AI enabled, it's smart, it's talking to each other, it could potentially lurk in your network or your infrastructure for some time without actually making any indicators or creating any indicators of compromise. And if you've got a swarm of really intelligent malware that's talking to each other, it can be sniffing around, looking for vulnerabilities, exploiting vulnerabilities, and then passing that on as a shared intelligence. So the swarm will actually go completely through your infrastructure, causing untold damage.
Some real big threats that we can look out for, specifically on the 5G, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll move now quickly into cloud. What I think has been lost for some time, I guess, is the this idea of the shared responsibility model. And I know a lot of the cloud service providers have been pushing this from the onset. But I think a lot of cloud users have, I guess, gone into cloud without actually appreciating the gravity, all of the, I guess, the overhead of the need to be able to bring a lot of these key security controls from our old castle days and then translate them to the cloud environment. So if you look at this particular slide, it's really good showing, what the actual cloud service provides as the cloud service provider's responsibility versus the customer's responsibility. And so Cornelius, just sort of thinking through that at the moment, this breakdown of, I guess, the shared responsibility model, we've seen through an IDC study last year, almost 80% of companies that they surveyed several hundred companies, had actually experienced a cloud-based breach. And it was some other really, really high one. I've got it here. Nearly half reported 10 or more breaches. So in terms of this shared responsibility model, something's obviously gone wrong.
I like that you mentioned that, and I think if we look at some of the, bring it back into the compliance and regulations, if we take CP 234 for the financial industry as an example, is they actually talk there to say we must presume already that we have a breach. Now, that can be debatable at a certain point where people say, hey, if you take that stance, we've already lost, which I don't think is the case. I think we should take that presumption from there is a breach in the environment, what does it mean? And that's very much that I really believe, and we'll talk about that from a strategic perspective, is how important it is to understand what are the threats, what does it mean in our environment, and get the visibility. Because if we look as an example, even though with those breaches, if we look at some of the stats, it's 67% of those stats are just misconfiguration. So we kind of look at that sometimes, we go, we've got good intent in that, right? So it's not just the intent always that gets us there. But if we look at that component, 67%, that's pretty huge. It's just I'm doing a configuration, it's misconfiguration. And I really believe some of the ways that we can help with that is bringing the automation. So understand what Fortinet can do as well to improve that exposure to risk is bringing that automation where you can, focusing on that infrastructure as code as much as possible from where you can. And I think another component there is visibility, is the lack of visibility. Just understand, again, where is my data? Where is it moving? Understand, again, that component of what you've just mentioned there. What is my responsibility? But I will bring those things back again and to bring it back to the identity. Just bring it back to who's on my network, what are they doing, when I'm moving with my data, how's that moving with that, and focusing on the errors. And all of those things, again, I believe is bring it back into what you guys can do from helping to analyze that and give reporting on that.
It's a real challenge, isn't it? If you think back to the good old days when we had the castle, and you think of core identity and access management principles, so things like need to know, and the minimum amount of privileges for you to be able to do your job, delegation of responsibilities, all these core things where we actually knew what the environment looked like. They're sort of broken now, and in some cases, even when we move to the cloud, it's not actually the security team that's probably going to be in charge of that project. It could be a business unit that just said, okay, we need to do some agile, get some agile capability out there really, really quick. Let's just do it. They might not even know that they need to think about some of these things.
And it's interesting to look at those stats, and I've got 3 slides away from here. I'll actually share that from what do we see in the market with it happening is can we measure it? Because of course, if we can measure it, we can look at how we can improve it. So there are some steps to actually address that.
Fantastic. So what I've got here is just, I guess, a little bit of a, executive summary of some of the top cloud risks. And obviously we've mentioned a couple of them before. So configuration errors. It's really interesting, as Cornelius mentioned, just how common these are and actually the cause of some of the main breaches. Now, looking at some of the historic breaches, when you move to the cloud, there's actually quite a huge number of different ways that that your environment can be configured, and I guess a lot of people are maybe even just sort of accepting the defaults and then accepting the risk that comes with it. We've sort of mentioned monitoring and breakdown in shared responsibility, but again, in the good old days in our castle, we actually had an information baseline, and it was easy enough. Well, actually, nothing's easy in cybersecurity, but it was actually
simple enough.
Yeah, you're able to say, okay, well, this is my traffic baseline. This is what normal and good looks like, and then you look for anomalies there. So that's one of the changes. Container environments that we've got there. So obviously, you've got sort of headless serverless type capabilities running through. So how do you actually patch something like that? How do you harden and build a standard operating environment? Database security, is there a whole bunch of separate privileges that your databases has got? Templates, we know that a lot of users are sort of pulling in templates from shared or open source sort of resource. Have we checked them? And then the other two we've sort of mentioned before, like privileged access is such a huge risk that possibly hasn't been thought of. But then also the security team, the security team has probably been worked around in some cases by a department or one of the organisations within our company, because the security team and the traditional IT just wasn't fast enough to keep with the company operation requirements.
And I had a meeting with one of the sizes last week, Tuesday, and we actually talked about this as well. From if we look at the top cloud risks, what is it that Fortinet can help with to protect with that? And I think that's really key to have a look, for instance, that Fortinet can help with your container security. When you spin it up, you can spin your WAF as a container as well, by, again, helping you with your, by creating templates that's easy to spin up, make it as part of your infrastructure as code to a big extent. So I think looking at those risks and knowing that there's, if we look at the Fortinet fabric, that we can actually help to address most of those risks, again, to help to reduce the risk there as much as possible.
Yeah, that's what I like about sort of some of your presentations, Cornelius. So like in a lot of cases, it's almost too hard. You look at that big list. Oh well, it's really, really hard. All we want to do is quickly get an application online in the cloud. But I like it how there's actually some practical steps and frameworks and I guess policies that customers can leverage that you've created for them to sort of approach this new reality.
Yeah. So I think if we look at that as well, right, and looking at these practical steps, one of the things for me is looking at and I think it was Apple that was using this, and Dr. Brene Brown talked about this, is using at the task model. Now, again, this is not how you spell task, but I think it's a real good example from understanding from what do we need to do in the cybersecurity capability, understand which teams is going to be accountable, but also how can we help our teams to success. What does it mean? So it's almost like if we have to paint what finish looks like, what would that look like? And can we actually have that in cybersecurity? Can we have this picture from, hey, we're done? And I think in security, we can't. So we need to look at the business initiatives that we need to do and align security strategies with that and know there's a continuous process. So a couple of key takeaways that I really believe is important for businesses to look at. And again, you can make it yours, right? This is just an idea. But by how can you, as a SaaS and a leadership capability, is how can you have that unfair advantage in business when it comes to looking at some of the cyber threats? Now, a big thing that I really believe we're going to see more this year is the component on regulations. And again, this is not going to solve world peace in your organization, and hopefully it's not going to cause world hunger in your organization either. But having that focus is a real good starting point. And from there, it will then lead into the metrics I need for my business that can then lead into your strategy. So again, understand what metrics I need for success and pull that into your strategy. I would then bring that into the threat landscape as well. So spend a lot of time with Glenn if you can, and connect with him afterwards to understand what are the changes in the environment and how that affects the number 5 is the business innovation. So that's going to be pretty much a key, because all of those components, once you have that, is then you can go and look at the assurance. So the number 6 should not drive number 3. So the strategy should not, it should drive the assessment and the assurance. That should not drive the strategy. And then bring it back into, I want to say, the metrics, by understanding the controls and the frameworks that we need to have in place. But then I want to bring those things together as well to say, what does it mean from training and what can we do from that? So that will be from training our people, but I will bring it back into the people, processes, and technology. Can we train our people? Absolutely, we have to. Can we train our technology to be better? And I believe we actually, we have to do that by looking at the consolidation and focusing on our processes. And there's a lot of components that we can talk to you guys there about using artificial intelligence to bring that in.
I really like that, Cornelius. I mean, I guess if you look at a lot of the sort of the compliance frameworks that are around, I think if a lot of organisations just say, hey, I need to do sort of A to Z of that actually is, besides the fact that it might not even be realistic at all, but it could be extremely costly. So I guess what you've done there, where you've said, okay, look at these inputs, look at the threat environment, look at the regulations that you need to adhere to, and then look at the specific, I guess, attack surface and threat surface of your organisation. Then build your security defence posture around there. That's probably a good way of going about it.
I think it's quite powerful to look at that, right? So if we look at just working with your team and the amount of threats that you guys see as well, you kind of know what's out there. And we know that it's sometimes taking this, I want to say, not the easy step, but taking these simple steps that can really help to improve your security posture.
Yeah, what was interesting last December, I was doing 2 sort of industry verticals. I was looking at the education sector and the medical sector, and it was very, very, I guess, illuminating to see that the threats were so different, and they were starkly different between those 2 sectors. Obviously, that's quite an extreme example of how different they are, but yours, in theory, your security approach to securing an educational institution is going to be a little bit different than if you're in a medical organisation.
Absolutely. So I think for what you've mentioned there is actually bring it back into what do we see from, I don't want to say security best practices. I want to rather say like what do we see in the industry perspective from that perspective around what do we see in the industry is happening. Because that will help you and guide if you're in education, what are some of the regulations for that? If it's in finance, what's the regulations for that? Because it can guide you into practical steps that's going to be important. But I think something that's going to be really important is if we look at the response takeover bill. is how what we've seen in the beginning was going to be critical infrastructure, how that is changing, and again, bring in that legislation that's going to be important for businesses to look at. So again, if you haven't seen this, I would recommend that you look at that link as well and just go and have a look at that infrastructure bill, look at the changes to the 2018 bill as well. But in essence, it is the higher education is going to be part of that, healthcare, medical, all of those components are part of that. And for me, with the takeaway there, I believe there's three things that we can focus on is, some of the activities that we must include is just have an incident response plan. If we take the component that you talked about, right, from if there is a breach in my environment, what do we do? If there is a breach from my cloud environment, what are the steps that I do from my responsibility model? Who do I notify? How do I notify and take that approach there?
I remember years ago I wrote an incident response plan for a customer, and it was actually, I look back now and it wasn't that good. It was very wordy and it looked all quite pretty. But in terms of actually being an actionable plan, it wasn't that. So I think, as you say, like an incident response plan that's absolutely reflects the reality of your organization and your threats. Who do I call? Who do I need to call the media? Do I need to call the CEO? Or do I need to call the board of directors? But keep it absolutely realistic and keep it, absolutely relevant, because when the incident breakout happens, people are going to be running around waving their hands, and you absolutely need a clear set of processes and procedures that keep everyone on the straight and narrow.
And I think with that comes to the last slide that I've got here is then how do we do that? And I think to be able to do that is where we need to look. And for me, again, it's not all the points, but I think that's where it's really important to bring in the strategy from that perspective, right? Is if we look at having, what we see people are having in the industry, it's having that incident-driven strategy. I'm sure you've seen that as well, right? From Glenn, I've got an incident here right now. What do we do from that stance? So I think that's the one that we've seen. Another one is the proactive approach. So that is where we're looking at the regulation and see what we can do and start to build those policies in place.
Just thinking that incident-driven strategy is such good advice when we just said that, sort of nearly half of the organisations that got surveyed had 10 or more cloud security breaches. So obviously, we're still not learning from the learning the hard way. So this is good advice.
Yes. And at the same time, compliance-driven strategies is one of those things that will be mostly from the bottom-up strategies. So the sizes and the leadership will help the board to become more, more responsive to those things. And then the fourth one, which you can call the unconscious approach. It's almost like the catch of the day. Which controls do we need today that's going to be applicable? If you guys joined the earlier session with Brom, one of the things that he talked about there is he's saying it's the knee jerking approach, where you just like hit the knee, and it's the unconscious approach. It's like, hey, what's the flavor of today that we need to bring, or what we need to do? So I think to a certain extent, those are some of the components that we've seen. But I think bringing that into some of the challenges, and this is the last slide I want to just leave it up with as well, is just to say, how can we do that, right? So I would advise people to go and have a look at, looking at the business continuity. Because if we look at example with NotPetya that hit Merck, one of the biggest shipment companies, they had, their business continuity plan was perfect, but it didn't include physical backups, right? Which nobody would have thought of because they had 150 odd domain controllers that was affected by that NotPetya within 90 seconds. If you look at that, so that's huge, right? So again, just bring it back into those simple steps by understanding, what is my disaster recovery? What is my backup? How do I communicate if everything is down? And I think that was a couple of $1 million effect for them, right? I think it was close to $670 million, the cost for that for the business. But then also bring it back into the incidents that you talked about.
Yeah.
But what do you think about bringing in the past incidents? I know we've got a minute left, but bringing in the past incidents and look at new trends. What's your view and take from that?
No, I think it's really, really important. I think the key thing here too is with a lot of these things, especially in that BCP DR space, make sure that you're exercising that all the time. It's really, really important, because I know, again, the NotPetya example is quite a, I guess it's absolutely revealing. And they probably thought that their backup was completely resilient, and they must have thought it an effective architecture, but obviously not. So, going through, looking at sort of new incidents as they arise, looking at sort of, I guess, the root cause, and then building that into an ever-increasing, I guess, sort of resilience framework is really, really good advice, because, don't just trust that it's going to work when things go bad. That's the worst time to be testing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we consolidate all of those things, I think that's the power of the Fortinet fabric, right? By having a look at, when we look at the cloud and the new edges that's forming, is how do we have visibility in those new edges that's forming, that intelligent edges that's forming? How do we have visibility in that?
And let the technology do some of the work for you.
Yeah.
So you know, when we say it, just how hard and how massive this problem is, yeah, let technology do some of the heavy lifting, leverage it.
Awesome. Glenn, really enjoyed talking to you there.
You too,
Thank
Cornelius.
you.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Looking forward
Awesome.
to the next session.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was fantastic. Really appreciate you guys jumping on and sharing those insights with us and the cyber community that have joined us today. That was a really great discussion between the two of you, and I really enjoyed listening to that and hearing your thoughts on what's going on in the industry at the moment. But we do have, I'll be able to ask you one question that we have in the Q&A, and that is, can you shed some insight into the development of cloud government standards, especially in the banking sector?
Can you just repeat the question for me again, Isaac?
that's
I
right.
apologize, couldn't hear that.
Can you shed some insights into the development of cloud governance standards, especially in the banking sector?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that we can share, and if I can just speak to the user there as well, a couple of things that we can share afterwards from the compliance and the frameworks, that we've seen a lot of development there, specifically with I want to say from the incidents that we've experienced in the Australian industry per se last year. But have a look at the components such as your ASD8s. Have a look at what they're doing there. And we've seen the changes there as well. If we look at some of the new NIST compliance capabilities, if we look at, again, I would look at the you know, if it's the OT or the financial sectors, is I would look at some of the capabilities that we've done there with the APRA and the CPS 234. What we've done there is we've actually looked at some of those mappings that you can do, and we've helped and I want to say guide customers then to go and look at what does it mean. So not just to understand what it is from those frameworks per se itself, but what can they then do by looking at the controls they need and also the metrics that they need. So we've looked at those things and we've applied Fortinet's fabric to that as well. But what we can do afterwards is share a link with where you can find that on LinkedIn to actually go into those details and look at the changes that we've seen there. And again, how do we approach that from a control and a metric perspective?
Yeah, fantastic. And with that, thank you so much, guys, for joining us today and for also sponsoring the event. Thank you, Fortinet, for supporting the event and being partners in this, because without our sponsors, we can't put on such things for the community. So we really appreciate your involvement and joining us this morning. It was fantastic. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Isaac.
So what we're going to do now, guys, is we have a quick 20-minute break, 18 minutes now, for everyone to quickly run, grab something to eat, get some water, go to the bathroom, do what you need to do in this next 18 minutes, and then join us back on the next session with Phil Dimitri from Sophos. And that will be in the timeline in the page that we're all navigating today. So yeah, join us then at 11:20 for an 11:20 start, and we look forward to having you all back. Thanks again, Corn and Glenn, for that.